Richard Ralph Baumgartner was born in 1947 in Ballston Spa, New York, the son of Ralph and Dorothea Baumgartner. He grew up in a modest household that valued service and responsibility, and these values shaped much of his early path in life. In his late teens, during a turbulent era in American history, he joined the United States Navy. From 1967 to 1970, he served on carrier cruises in Southeast Asia. The discipline, order, and intensity of those years left their mark on him, giving him a sense of purpose and a belief that he was capable of carrying heavy responsibilities. When his military service ended, he turned his focus toward education. He enrolled at East Tennessee State University, which began his lifelong connection with Tennessee. From there, he went on to the University of Tennessee College of Law and graduated in 1977. Returning from war and newly armed with a legal education, Baumgartner was eager to make his mark in the courts. He began his career in private practice in Knoxville, working as a defense attorney. The work immersed him in the complex world of criminal law, where he learned not just statutes and procedures, but also the human realities of crime, poverty, addiction, and desperation. He built a reputation for diligence and competence, and over the years he gained the respect of colleagues and others in the legal community. In 1992, a turning point came when Baumgartner was appointed to the Knox County Criminal Court bench. The governor at the time selected him to replace Judge Randy Nichols. Baumgartner stepped into a position of enormous responsibility, overseeing felony trials, murder cases, and some of the county's most serious criminal proceedings. For many in Knoxville, he became the face of justice, presiding over trials that carried life-and-death consequences. As a judge, he began to shape a distinct identity. He helped establish and champion a drug court program, designed to give nonviolent offenders a chance at treatment and rehabilitation rather than only punishment. This was not a common stance for a criminal court judge in Tennessee at the time, and it showed a more compassionate side to his approach. He also allowed more media access into his courtroom than many of his peers, believing in the value of public transparency. At the same time, he became known for his commanding presence in high-profile trials such as the cases involving Thomas D. Husky, a suspected serial killer, and later the Christian Newsom case, one of the most disturbing crimes in Knoxville's history. By the early 2000s, Baumgartner had become an established figure in the local justice system. He had built a reputation for seriousness and thoroughness, and he was re-elected to his position by the people. To the public, he appeared to be a strong, reliable figure who carried the weight of Knox County's justice system on his shoulders. But in the background, signs of trouble were already there. He suffered from pancreatitis, a condition often linked to heavy drinking. He also began to rely on painkillers and other prescription medications. Colleagues and staff noticed changes in him at times. Moments of fatigue, slurred speech, or behavior that seemed unusual. For a while, these concerns were seen as private health matters, the kind of struggles any person might face quietly while still performing their duties. This tension between his public image and his private reality became a defining feature of his career. On one hand, he was the decorated Navy veteran, the respected lawyer, and the stern but innovative judge who championed alternatives like drug court. On the other hand, he was a man quietly struggling with health issues and addiction, a struggle that he believed he could control even as it gradually began to take control of him. By the end of 2010, Baumgartner stood as one of the most prominent judges in Tennessee's criminal courts. He had presided over the toughest cases, built programs meant to help offenders find a second chance, and maintained a visible place in public life. Yet, behind the bench, in the shadows of his professional achievements, the seeds of his eventual downfall were already growing. It begins almost like a small private drama that accidentally became a public crime. In 2009, Dina Castleman, a young woman who had previously been through Baumgartner's drug court program, was found with a stash of prescription pills during a law enforcement sweep of her residence. That search produced enough narcotics to trigger a criminal charge. Castleman was arrested on May 27, 2009. The discovery of the pills was the physical spark that set investigators looking around the scene and asking who had been supplying her. From the beginning, Castleman's name had a strange echo in the courthouse. She had been a participant in the very drug court program Baumgartner ran, and when she landed in trouble again, she reached out to him. According to multiple accounts introduced at trial and in the TBI file, she wrote to Baumgartner to explain her arrest and legal trouble. Rather than keep her at arm's length, Baumgartner became personally involved. He gave her money, bought her a cell phone to coordinate transactions, and even asked her to procure hydrocodone for him. Those acts turned a private connection into an investigative thread once law enforcement began to connect the pills to people around Castleman. Investigators quickly found that Castleman's room yielded more than a slip of contraband, a cache of prescription pills that suggested regular diversion, not a one-time lapse. That cache prompted local police and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, to open a deeper inquiry, and when TBI agents interviewed Castleman, she didn't just point at a shadowy dealer. She named people and described a relationship with a powerful local figure who had been supplying her with money and who, she said, had taken sexual favors. Those admissions made investigators look outside Castleman's immediate circle and toward the courthouse. They subpoenaed phone records, housing and program logs, and prescription histories. That paper trail showed a pattern. Baumgartner had given Castleman money on repeated occasions. He bought her a cell phone to facilitate transactions. She later introduced him to one of her suppliers, and Baumgartner began buying pills directly. Calls, dates, and witness statements lined up. In short, the TBI didn't rely on one confessio. They lined up records and witnesses that repeated the same tale. The human witnesses were critical. TBI agents interviewed other judges, housing directors, prosecutors, and court staff who remembered odd interventions by Baumgartner on Castleman's behalf. For example, Baumgartner phoned Judge Donald Elledge about Castleman after her arrest and vouched for her as a drug court candidate. He spoke to a YWCA housing director and tried to get Castleman into transitional housing, and then tried to have someone else's urine submitted when staff suspected drug use. He persuaded juvenile court magistrate Stan Briggs to vacate an arrest warrant, and he approached prosecutor Jeffrey Blevins asking for leniency. In many instances, the people he spoke to later testified that what he said did not line up with the evidence, and that their contact with him became part of the concealment narrative. Those conversations became specific counts in the federal indictment. Another thread investigators followed was Baumgartner's medical prescription history. The TBI pulled prescription records and found an alarming volume of legal prescriptions from many different providers. Records that, when combined with Castleman's statements and the reports of pills being handed to Baumgartner during court breaks, painted a picture of dependence and diversion. At the post-conviction hearing and in documents filed later, investigators and attorneys noted he had obtained large numbers of opioid pills. The filings cite thousands of pills over a couple of years and prescriptions from many different clinicians. Those medical prescription records provided hard, quantitative backing to what had long been rumor in the courthouse, that Baumgartner was taking massive amounts of narcotics and supplementing prescriptions with street buys. Perhaps the most telling moments came from people who watched him in court. Personnel and attorneys who had practiced in his courtroom described a judge whose behavior changed, slurred speech confusion about hearings, impatience, or sleeping through parts of trials, and who, in several instances, had done or said things that later appeared to be efforts to protect Castleman from the consequences of her drug activity. A YWCA housing director later told investigators about Baumgartner saying Castleman had passed a drug test when she had not, and a judge recalled being approached in the courthouse by Baumgartner urging some form of leniency. Those on-the-ground recollections gave investigators a series of small, contemporaneous incidents that, in total, were difficult to explain as innocuous. With Castleman's statements, the pills, the phone and prescription records, and the corroborating witness interviews, federal investigators, with the TBI doing the field work, had enough to present to a grand jury. In May 2012, a federal grand jury returned a 7-count indictment charging Baumgartner with misprision of felony, essentially, that he knew of a federal felony, the controlled substance conspiracy, and took active steps to conceal it rather than report it. The indictment listed discrete episodes where he allegedly made material misrepresentations to various officials in order to keep Castleman out of trouble. Conduct, the government said, protected his pill supply and sexual relationship. At trial, the prosecution laid out the mosaic: Castleman's statements, the pill cache, the cell phone purchase and cash transfers. witness testimony from judges and the YWCA director, and the prescription records that showed a judge with heavy legitimate prescriptions supplemented by illicit purchases. The government's narrative was that Baumgartner's repeated lies and interventions were not casual kindnesses. They were affirmative steps to conceal a conspiracy source. After a 9-day trial in federal court in Knoxville, a jury convicted Baumgartner on multiple counts in November 2012. The FBI, DOJ press materials and trial transcripts make clear the TBI investigation, the documentary evidence, and the witness testimony were the pillars of the case. Sentencing followed in spring 2013. Although the statutory exposure on paper was higher, Baumgartner was sentenced to 6 months in prison, followed by supervised release, and did report to a federal camp to serve his term. The conviction, prison time, and the earlier state plea to official misconduct ended his judicial career and produced a cascade of legal fallout. His disbarment, retrials in cases he had presided over while impaired, and a long public reckoning for a courthouse that had been slow to confront its own. A few final investigative details show why this was not an overnight takedown. This case illustrates how investigations into powerful people often depend on small, ordinary evidentiary of an officer's patrol. A housing sweep, a receptionist who notices a judge's frequent visits, a seized bag of pills, an interview where someone decides to tell everything, and then the ability of investigators to stitch those threads into a coherent picture. In Baumgartner's case, those threads were the physical pills in Castleman's room, Castleman's disclosures, the paper trail of cell phone and prescriptions, multiple independent witnesses who recalled his interventions on Castleman's behalf, and documentary proof that his statements to other officials weren't true. Together, they moved suspicion into indictment and then into conviction. When the truth about Judge Richard Baumgartner's secret life finally came out, Knoxville was stunned. For years, he had managed to maintain the image of a steady and respected criminal court judge, but once the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation uncovered his drug abuse, his misuse of power, and his entanglement with defendants who had appeared in his courtroom, the carefully built facade collapsed almost overnight. The immediate aftermath began in 2011, when he abruptly resigned from the bench after pleading guilty to a single felony count of official misconduct. This plea was part of a deal that allowed him to avoid prison at the time, but the consequences were already devastating. He lost the judgeship he had held for nearly 20 years, was forced into rehab, and saw his name stripped from the courthouse program he had once proudly championed. The fall from grace was swift and public. A man who had presided over some of Knoxville's most notorious trials was now himself branded as a criminal. The damage, however, went far beyond his personal disgrace. Many of the high-profile cases he had overseen came under review. Most famously, the Christian Newsom murder trials were thrown into turmoil. Because Baumgartner had been impaired during parts of the proceedings, defense attorneys argued that the convictions could not be trusted. The victims' families, who had already endured the trauma of lengthy trials, now faced the possibility of retrials. Years of work by prosecutors and law enforcement were suddenly jeopardized because the judge had not been sober and ethical on the bench. The community was outraged, and the sense of betrayal was enormous. The legal system struggled to repair the damage. Replacement judges had to step in, and appeals wound their way through the courts. The Tennessee Supreme Court eventually ruled that Baumgartner's misconduct had tainted the trials enough to warrant new proceedings. For many in Knoxville, this was a bitter pill. Justice delayed yet again, because of one man's secret descent into addiction and corruption. For Baumgartner personally, the consequences deepened after his resignation. Federal prosecutors later charged him with misprision of a felony, essentially accusing him of covering up criminal conduct while serving as a judge. A jury found him guilty in 2012, and in 2013 he was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, followed by supervised release. To many, the sentence seemed light compared to the chaos he had caused, but it was nevertheless a humiliating end for a man who once commanded a courtroom. After serving his sentence, Baumgartner faded from public life. His law license was permanently stripped, and his name, once linked with authority and justice, became synonymous with scandal. Friends and colleagues described him as a broken man, humbled by disgrace and struggling to live quietly outside the spotlight. He never regained his old stature, and the shadow of the scandal remained with him until his death in 2018. The aftermath of Baumgartner's fall was felt for years in East Tennessee. It left scars on the families of victims who had to relive their tragedies. It strained the trust between the public and the courts, and it became a cautionary tale about unchecked power and private demons. What made it so shocking was not only the scandal itself, but the contrast between the man Baumgartner had seemed to be and the man he truly was behind closed doors.